The wind whispered through the pines like an old song nobody remembered the words to. Winter clung to the mountains longer than usual that year, turning the dirt roads to ribbons of ice and hiding the trails under thick sheets of snow. The forest was silent, heavy with the hush that comes before a storm, or a story worth telling. Eli Morgan lived alone in that silence. His cabin stood nestled deep in the Wyoming woods, miles from the nearest town and farther still from anything resembling civilization. He'd built it with his own hands after leaving behind a life that had cost him too much. Years ago, he'd come west to forget, to start fresh, to bury what had been lost. Now, he spoke to no one but the wind and the wolves. That afternoon, the sky had gone a shade of steel, hinting at snow. Eli had just finished splitting a stack of pine logs when he saw her. At first, she was nothing but a shape through the trees. Small, unsteady, wrapped in a long coat and scarf, her hands clutched tightly around a bag that looked too heavy for her frame. She stumbled, then stood again, her breath showing like ghost smoke. He should have turned away. Strangers meant stories. Stories meant trouble. But she fell, and Eli wasn't the kind of man who could walk away from that. He crossed the clearing in long strides, boots crunching on the frost. When he reached her, she tried to rise on her own but barely managed a word. "Please," she whispered. Eli caught her just before she slipped again. "You're a long way from town," he said gruffly, helping her to her feet. "Storm's coming. You won't make it far." She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth. Eli gave her the only blanket he wasn't using and poured a cup of coffee so strong it could have woken a ghost. She sipped it slowly, her hand shaking. "Name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Clara." He didn't press. He never did. "Stay one night," he muttered, almost to himself. "Storm will pass by morning." But deep down, something told him nothing would ever be the same after that night. The firelight danced shadows across the walls of Eli's cabin, painting the logs in soft amber tones. Clara sat close to the flames, her coat draped over a nearby chair, boots drying by the hearth. She hadn't said much since arriving. Her eyes flicked around the room, noting everything. The sturdy tools on the shelves, the rifle hanging over the mantel, the neat stack of firewood by the door. She was looking for safety, or maybe an escape route. Eli understood both. He stirred a pot of stew over the fire, the smell of meat and thyme thick in the air. It was the first time in years he'd cooked for someone else. "You hungry?" he asked without turning. She nodded. "Starving." He handed her a bowl, simple and hot. She took it with trembling fingers, but her voice was steadier now. "You live here all alone? By choice? You always help strangers?" He didn't answer. She took a bite, then another. Slower this time. Her body was warming, her cheeks gaining a bit of color. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked. Eli leaned back in his chair. "I talk when there's something worth saying." Clara smiled faintly, the first sign of softness beneath the guardedness. "Then I'll try to be interesting." Outside, the wind began to rise, whistling between the trees like a warning. Inside, the silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It had shape now, like something living. Clara watched the flames, her eyes distant. "I didn't mean to come this far," she said softly. Eli looked over, waiting. "I was headed for Jackson, but the stagecoach driver left me behind when we stopped in Elk Creek. He said I was too much trouble." She let out a bitter laugh. "Guess I was asking too many questions." Eli's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay there." She didn't explain further, but she didn't have to. Eli could hear what she wasn't saying. Some people ran towards something. Others ran away. He'd been both. The fire popped. A log shifted. She startled slightly, then quickly hid it. "You can take the bed," he said, standing. "I'll sleep by the fire." "You don't have to do that." "I ain't asking." He laid out a blanket near the hearth and took off his boots. She watched him a moment, then nodded, quiet again. When she finally went to bed, she left the door to the bedroom open. Just a crack. Eli didn't sleep much. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the cabin floor. He lay on his back with one arm behind his head, listening, not to the storm outside, but to the soft breathing behind the half-closed bedroom door. It had been years since anyone else's presence filled this space. Years since someone else's footsteps had creaked the floorboards or warmed the air with their voice. He hadn't missed it, or at least that's what he used to tell himself. But Clara's arrival brought a strange tension, like something had shifted inside the walls. The air was thicker, the silence heavier. And Eli couldn't stop wondering, who was she really running from? Clara lay curled under the quilt, her body finally warm but her mind wide awake. The room smelled faintly of pine and ash, of earth and old wood. Everything the world she came from was not. There was no wallpaper here, no polished furniture, no clinking of silver spoons and porcelain cups, and yet she had never felt so safe. But safety was a fleeting thing. She knew that better than most. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket tighter as memories surged. She saw the telegram she never sent, the bruises that had faded, the man in the black coat who had called himself her fiancé. She had run from a life that others would have called comfortable. But what's comfort without kindness? Clara sat up slowly, glancing toward the open door. She could see the faint outline of Eli by the fire, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. He was large, quiet, weather-worn, but not unkind. There was something old in him, something steady. She wondered what he'd left behind to end up all the way out here. Just before dawn, Eli stirred from a light sleep, catching movement from the corner of his eye. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You all right?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. "I couldn't sleep," she said, then paused. "It's quiet out here." He nodded. "That's the idea." She stepped closer to the fire, kneeling beside it, her eyes searching his. "I'm sorry I just showed up. I didn't mean to bring trouble." "Did you?" he asked evenly. Her jaw tightened. "Maybe." Eli studied her, the way her eyes darted down, the tension in her shoulders. "I've handled trouble before," he said finally. "Just don't lie to me." She looked up. "I haven't." "Good." They sat in silence a while longer. The storm had passed, but the clouds hung low, reluctant to let in the sun. "I should leave by noon," Clara said quietly. "You can leave," Eli replied, "when your legs aren't shaking and the road is clear." She gave him a tired smile. "That might take longer than a day." He looked at her then, really looked. "Then it'll take longer than a day." By mid-morning, the world outside had softened. A fresh layer of snow blanketed the trees and ground, smoothing out the jagged earth into something almost peaceful. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that seemed cleaner, but not emptier. Eli was already outside, chopping more wood. Clara watched him from the window, her breath fogging the glass. He moved with a quiet rhythm, each swing of the axe clean and deliberate. There was no wasted motion, no frustration, only purpose. He hadn't asked her any questions. Not yet. But she could feel them hanging in the air, waiting for her to decide whether or not to trust him with the truth. She stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee, the chill immediately biting her cheeks. "You'll freeze without gloves," Eli said without turning, but he accepted the coffee just the same. "I've had worse," Clara replied. They stood there a moment, sharing silence the way other people shared stories. Finally, she spoke. "Your place? It's beautiful out here. Quiet?" "It's not for everyone. It's not supposed to be," she said. "I think that's the point." Eli looked at her, eyebrows raised. "You a philosopher now?" Clara smirked. "Just someone who needed to breathe." Later, while she helped stack the wood beside the porch, they found tracks in the snow. "Not animal, not familiar. Boot prints. Fresh." Eli crouched beside them, his expression hardening. "Someone's been through here," he muttered. Clara went still. "How recent?" "Too recent." He stood, scanning the trees with a hunter's eyes. "One person, alone, walking slow." "Do you think they saw us?" "Can't tell." Clara's face paled, and for the first time Eli saw something close to panic flash in her eyes. He didn't push, but he didn't look away either. "Come inside," he said firmly. "And this time, lock the door behind you." That night, Clara didn't speak much. She stayed close to the fire, eyes darting toward the window every time the wind moved the trees. Eli cleaned and oiled his rifle at the kitchen table. He didn't say a word about the boot prints again, but she knew he was ready. He'd seen enough to recognize danger before it showed its face. And Clara? She'd seen enough to know when it was already too late. The next morning, Clara woke before the sun. The cabin was still, wrapped in early blue shadows. A thin layer of frost had crept along the inside of the windows. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped quietly into the main room, careful not to wake Eli. He sat in the chair by the fire, already awake, rifle across his lap. He hadn't slept. Clara blinked, surprised. "You stayed up all night?" He nodded once. Didn't like the way those tracks looked. She didn't ask if he'd seen anything else. She didn't want to know the answer. Instead, she poured water into the kettle and placed it on the stove. Her fingers trembled slightly. Eli noticed. "You running from someone?" he said flatly. Not a question, but not quite a statement either. Clara stood still, her back to him. "Yes." Silence settled like dust between them. "I didn't do anything wrong," she added quietly. "Not the kind of wrong that should have me looking over my shoulder." Eli waited. I was supposed to marry a man I didn't choose, she continued, voice low. Wealthy, influential, dangerous in ways he never had to show directly. My father made the arrangement, said it was for the family, for my future. Eli said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He tried to control everything, she went on. My clothes, my letters, even my words. When I said no, he didn't take it well. I left with what I could carry. Been moving since. Now she turned to face him. Her eyes were raw but steady. I didn't come here to bring trouble. I just needed one night to stop running. Eli leaned forward, setting the rifle gently on the table. I don't care what that man was promised. If he comes here, he'll have to walk back without you, or not walk back at all. Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected protection. Not from a stranger in the woods. I don't want you getting hurt for me, she whispered. Eli's eyes met hers, calm and clear. Not everything worth protecting needs to be explained. Later that day, Clara found herself sweeping the cabin floor. Eli was out at the edge of the woods, checking for more signs of the stranger. The rhythm of the broom helped settle her nerves. With every pass, it felt like she was clearing more than just dust. She was clearing the weight of the past. There was peace here, even if only temporary, and part of her, slowly and quietly, wanted to belong to it. The snow was softer now, melting in patches under the weak sun. Birds had started returning to the trees, their songs tentative, like they were unsure if winter had truly loosened its grip. Eli crouched low, near the trail that curved behind the cabin, his breath still in the cool morning air. There, again, boot prints, newer, deeper. He rose, eyes narrowing. Whoever it was had doubled back, and this time they were closer. Too close. Clara felt it before she saw him return. Something in the air changed, tighter, heavier. When Eli walked in, dusting snow from his shoulders, she knew by the way he shut the door firmly behind him. He was here again, Eli said. Watch the cabin from the ridge. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. You're sure it's him? I don't know, but he's tracking you, not me. Clara swallowed. He won't stop. He'll send others if he thinks I'm still alive. Eli's tone turned flinty. He thinks you're his property? Clara nodded, ashamed of the truth. Eli paced once, then looked her dead in the eyes. You're not anyone's property. That evening the wind shifted. The quiet was different. Too quiet. Eli loaded his rifle and lit only one lamp, keeping the others dark. He positioned Clara in the back corner of the cabin and handed her the small pistol he kept in a lockbox beneath the floorboards. You ever shoot before? He asked. She hesitated. Once, at a tin can. Don't hesitate if it comes to more than that. Clara looked at him, her voice a rasp. Why are you doing this for me? Eli stared at the fire, his voice low. Because I know what it feels like to be hunted by your past. And because maybe some things are worth standing in front of. They waited. Minutes crawled by like hours. Outside, the wind brushed snow from the branches. Then a crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Eli's hand gripped the rifle tight. A shadow passed by the window. Clara held her breath. A knock. 3 slow, heavy raps on the cabin door. Eli moved like a ghost, silent but sure, positioning himself beside the door. Another knock. Then a voice, muffled but clear through the wood. Clara Mayfield, I know you're in there. Your father wants you returned. He's offering money. Eli's voice cut through the silence, low and cold. She's not going anywhere. A pause. Then the sound of boots retreating into snow. But neither Clara nor Eli believed that would be the end of it. Trouble had found them, and it would be back, with more than just words next time. By dawn, the world had changed again. Eli stood on the porch, arms crossed, scanning the trees as if daring them to move. The stranger hadn't returned during the night, but that meant little. Silence was only ever the calm before the real kind of storm. Inside the cabin, Clara was folding the same blanket over and over, her hands restless. She kept glancing at the window, her expression caught between fear and decision. I won't let him hurt you, she said suddenly, loud enough for Eli to hear. He turned. I'm not worried about me. I mean it, Clara added, stepping out onto the porch beside him. If he comes back, I'll face him. I won't hide behind anyone. Eli looked at her. Her eyes didn't waver this time. She was still afraid, but now something stronger burned beneath it. Resolve. You don't hide, he said. You survive. That's different. Later that morning, Eli took Clara into the woods. They moved quietly, winding between pine and snowdrifts until they reached a rocky bluff overlooking the valley. This is the only trail leading in, he explained. You see someone coming, you get back to the cabin fast. No hesitation. Clara nodded, scanning the path, taking in every tree, every dip in the snow. He handed her a small compass and showed her the turnoff that led behind the ridge, an escape route if needed. But Clara didn't look like she was planning to run. "I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to fight back," she said softly. "I always thought the world would win first." "It hasn't yet," Eli replied. She smiled just faintly. "Maybe that's because of you." That afternoon, they worked together. Clara helped Eli reinforce the door, added a second bar across the back window, and even helped dig a small trench line near the outer tree line, just deep enough to catch someone off guard. They worked in silence, not needing many words now. There was something intimate in the rhythm of shared labor, something honest in the sweat and the snow. Eli handed her a mug of coffee once the sun began to fall. She took it, their hands brushing briefly. "You don't have to keep me here," she said. "You don't owe me anything." He looked at her for a long time. "You stayed one night," he said slowly, "but that night changed everything." And just as the last light of day faded, a hawk circled low over the trees. A sign, perhaps, that the storm hadn't passed yet, but neither of them would face it alone. The next day dawned pale and cold. Clara sat at the window with a cup of coffee, the warmth from the fire brushing her back. Eli had already been out for hours, checking traps, scanning the tree line, sharpening silence into instinct. He moved like a man who'd spent a lifetime in the woods and trusted them more than people. But even the woods couldn't keep danger out forever. Clara's fingers curled tighter around the mug. She could feel it. The quiet was changing, less peaceful now, like breath being held. She set the mug down and stood. It was time. Eli returned with news that neither surprised nor comforted her. "They've camped out down by Dead Man's Hollow," he said, stripping off his coat. 3 men, armed, and not in a hurry." Clara's breath hitched. "He sent more." Eli nodded. "They're waiting, watching, maybe hoping you'll come down easy." "I won't." "I know." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Clara said, "We could slip out the back trail, the one you showed me. I could disappear farther west. They'd lose me in a week." Eli's jaw tightened. "You could, but that would mean you stay behind. I've done that before." She walked up to him, eyes searching his face. "You don't have to save me, Eli." "No," he said gently, "but maybe I want to." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The wind whispered again through the trees, but it wasn't the same song it sang days ago. This one sounded older, closer. She crept from her bed and walked to the fire. Eli was already there, seated with the rifle across his knees. "I can't ask you to die for me," she whispered. He looked at her. "You're not asking." She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat from his skin. Her voice trembled. "I've never had anyone stand for me, Eli, not really." "I'm not standing for you," he said quietly. "I'm standing with you." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, like a door opening in the soul. She reached out first, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. He didn't pull away. By morning, snow began to fall again, and down in Dead Man's Hollow, 3 men saddled up slowly. Unaware they were riding straight into a place that had already chosen its side. By sunrise, Eli had fortified the cabin like a fortress. He'd reinforced the window shutters with extra boards, packed dry powder into his cartridges, and stationed his second rifle within arm's reach. Clara helped silently, every movement precise, her mind focused. This wasn't fear anymore. It was preparation. They didn't speak much that morning. There was no need. Every glance between them carried weight, a shared understanding that something had changed between them, something unspoken but unbreakable. They weren't just defending a cabin. They were defending something that mattered. Shortly after midday, they heard the first sounds. Hooves crunching snow. Slow, deliberate, meant to be heard. Clara froze beside the fireplace, her hand clutching the small pistol Eli had shown her how to use days earlier. Her breath came shallow. Eli stepped to the window, peered through the gap in the boards. 3 riders, he murmured. "Same ones." He turned back, voice even. "You stay here. Only fire if someone comes through that door. Don't waste a bullet." She nodded, her jaw clenched tight. Outside, the lead rider dismounted, adjusted his coat, and stepped toward the porch. The other 2 stayed mounted, rifles across their laps. Eli opened the door, but only halfway. The man was tall, clean-shaven, with a smugness that no weather could wash off. "You Eli Morgan?" he asked. "I am. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Thomas Granger. He's looking for someone. Said you might be harboring her." "Don't know any Granger." "Lady by the name of Clara Mayfield?" "Don't know her either." The man smirked. "You're not good at lying, Morgan." Eli didn't blink. "Better than you are at walking away." A long pause. Then, "She's betrothed. Her father made an agreement, which she broke. She's not property." "She's trouble." Eli's voice dropped. "Then we've got something in common." The rider took a step forward. Last chance. Hand her over, and we'll be gone before nightfall. Eli stepped fully onto the porch now, rifle raised. Not pointed, but ready. She's not going anywhere. The man narrowed his eyes. Behind him, the two riders tightened their grips. And just like that, the first shot rang out. Clara ducked as glass shattered. A bullet tore through the top frame of the window. Eli fired back once, clean and sharp. One rider fell from his horse. The second bolted for cover. The lead man dove behind a tree as Eli took cover behind a porch beam. Inside the cabin, Clara pressed her back to the wall, hands shaking but firm on the pistol. Another shot, then silence. The world held its breath. Then footsteps. Fast. Too fast. Someone was circling around the side of the cabin. Eli couldn't see him, but Clara heard him. Her heart pounded in her ears. She waited. Just like Eli told her. Only fire if they come through the door. And then it opened. A man burst in, rifle raised. Clara squeezed the trigger. Bang! The man dropped. Outside, the last rider fled into the woods, shouting curses that faded into the trees. Eli didn't pursue. He turned back toward the cabin, toward Clara. She stood in the doorway, shaking, the pistol dangling in her hand. Their eyes met, and then slowly she stepped into his arms. He held her close, grounding her in the present, in the fact that she had survived, that they both had. By dusk, the gunpowder had faded from the air, but the echoes of the morning still lingered like a shadow along the edges of the cabin. Eli dragged the body away from the porch, wrapping it in canvas and leaving it for the marshal to deal with, if one ever came. He didn't say much afterward. He didn't need to. His movements were methodical, efficient. Survival had a rhythm, and he knew it better than most. Clara, meanwhile, sat quietly at the table, staring at her hands. They still trembled now and then, but not from fear. From adrenaline, from realization, from the weight of a life that almost ended and didn't. When Eli finally came back inside, his eyes went straight to her. "You all right?" he asked. Clara nodded. "He was going to kill you. You stopped him." "I didn't want to kill anyone." Eli crouched beside her, taking her hands gently in his. "You didn't want to. You had to. That's the difference." She looked into his eyes, steady, quiet, certain. And for the first time since she'd run, she believed she wasn't alone anymore. That night they didn't sleep much, but this time it wasn't out of fear. They talked. For hours, Eli told her about the life he'd left behind. A ranch in Montana, a brother lost in a land dispute, a family torn apart by greed and bullets. He came to the woods not because he loved solitude, but because he could no longer stand what the world had become. Clara shared more of her story too, not just the arranged engagement, but the way her mother had cried behind closed doors, the coldness of dinners with men who only saw her as a bargain piece. She'd grown up caged in luxury, suffocating in expectation. "I used to think the stars were just something painted on the ceiling of a ballroom," she whispered. "Now, they're real." Eli smiled faintly. "They've always been real. Just takes the right kind of night to see 'em." Outside, the snow fell again, light, slow, cleansing. Inside, two souls sat close by the fire, sharing something deeper than words. A bond forged not in romance novels or promises whispered in parlors, but in silence, in survival, and in the decision to stay. Morning brought no danger, only light. Golden rays broke through the pine boughs, casting a soft glow across the snow-covered earth. Birds sang again, this time without caution. The storm, both the one in the sky and the one in their lives, had passed. Clara stood on the porch, her shawl drawn tightly over her shoulders, watching the world breathe. Eli stepped beside her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He gave her one without a word. They drank in silence. Not the tense kind that had filled the first few days. This was something different, comfortable, worn in, real. "You could leave today," Eli said finally. Clara looked at him, eyebrows raised. "You're not wrong," she said, quiet. "The storm's passed. Road'll open soon. If you wanted to keep going west, you'd have a clean shot." He didn't say you should go, and he didn't say stay, not directly. But Clara heard everything he didn't say. She set the mug down on the railing and turned to him fully. "When I showed up at your cabin, I thought I'd rest one night, then vanish again. I remember, but everything changed. Not just because you helped me, because of how you didn't ask for anything in return, because you looked at me like I wasn't broken, like I wasn't running." "You weren't," Eli said. "You were surviving." She stepped closer. "So were you." For a long time, they just stood there. Then Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A silver brooch. It shimmered in the morning sun, delicate and ornate. "This was my mother's," she said. "The only thing I kept when I left. I thought it'd remind me of home, but it just reminded me of who I used to be." She pressed it into his hand. Now it'll remind me of who I found. Eli held it gently, his rough fingers folding around the fragile piece of silver. You sure? She nodded. I don't need it anymore. That afternoon they worked together in the shed, repairing a broken hinge, tending the horses, shoveling the last of the heavy snow. Clara laughed once, truly laughed, when Eli slipped on the ice and swore under his breath. You sure you've lived out here long enough to claim you're an expert? She teased. I'm better with trees than walkways, he grumbled, brushing snow off his coat. As the sun dipped again behind the trees, Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching the woods glow amber. I stayed one night, she murmured. Eli stepped behind her. And you changed everything. That night, the fire crackled low while Clara sat at the table with a pen in her hand and a blank piece of paper before her. Eli had gone out to check the traps one last time before the snow returned. He trusted the woods. Clara was still learning how to. She stared at the paper for a long while. Then finally, she began to write. Dear Father, you always said a lady's reputation is everything. But what good is a reputation if it costs you your freedom? If it makes you a prisoner in your own skin? You won't understand why I left, I know that. Maybe you never will. You called it duty. I called it suffocation. You chose a man who could buy me a future. I chose a man who gave me back my breath. She paused, then continued. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing to let you know I found something out here in the cold, a truth. Not about you, about myself. You told me to be quiet, he tells me to speak. You told me to obey, he listens. You told me love is what's arranged. He's teaching me it's what's earned. She stopped writing then, folded the paper slowly. She didn't know if she'd ever send it. But writing it felt like closing a door that had been left open for too long. Eli returned as night settled in. He noticed the change in her immediately, something quieter, steadier. She didn't say anything about the letter, and he didn't ask. Instead, they sat by the fire, the kind of closeness that didn't need words to feel like something sacred. The wind picked up after midnight, rattling the shutters just enough to make them lean closer together. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. What happens now? She asked softly. Eli stared into the flames. That depends, he said. You still feel like running? Clara looked up at him. No, not anymore. He let out a breath, one he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then I'd say we build. Outside, the snow began to fall again. But this time it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a beginning. The days passed more gently now. Clara had stopped counting them. She no longer woke with the urge to listen for footsteps in the snow or flinch at the sound of hooves in the distance. The forest was no longer a place to hide. It had become a place to be. Together they built a rhythm. Eli showed her how to mend fences, how to track the small game that wandered close to the cabin. Clara, in turn, showed him how to organize the storeroom with far more precision than he ever thought necessary. She mended torn shirts with perfect stitches, and he built her a small bookshelf beside the hearth, without asking, just noticing. They didn't speak of the past anymore, not because it was forgotten, because it had finally loosened its grip. One morning, Eli came in with something hidden behind his back. His boots were muddy, his hat tilted just a little lower than usual. Clara looked up from peeling potatoes. What's that? He shifted awkwardly, then brought it forward. A sapling. Small, still bundled in its roots. A pine no more than 2 feet tall. You brought me a tree? She said, tilting her head. Eli shrugged. You said you missed planting things. Thought maybe you could put something down that grows. Clara stared at it, stunned. Not by the tree itself, but by what it meant, by what he heard, even when she didn't mean to say it aloud. They planted it together near the front of the cabin, just where the porch ended and the tree line began. The dirt was hard, the wind crisp, but Clara's hands were steady. When they finished, she stood back and looked at the sapling, swaying slightly in the wind. You think it'll survive here? She asked. Eli crossed his arms. It will. How do you know? He looked at her, his voice low and sure. Because it's got strong roots now. That night, the snow held off. The sky above the clearing was velvet dark, strewn with stars. They sat together on the porch, a blanket over both their shoulders. Eli's arm was around her. Her head rested on his chest. There was no need for words, no fear, only the quiet certainty that sometimes the best love stories don't start with fireworks or fancy dresses. Sometimes they begin with one night in the woods and the decision to stay. Spring came quietly like a promise kept. Snow melted into thirsty earth. Wildflowers pushed through patches of frost, bright and stubborn. The woods shifted from silver to green, and the air carried scents of pine sap and new beginnings. Inside the cabin, everything felt different, though nothing had changed in any grand way. The same hearth, the same walls, the same old wooden table. But the stillness no longer echoed. It hummed. There was life here now. Clara had begun to hum while she worked, something Eli noticed first without quite realizing it. A quiet melody. One he didn't recognize but came to love. She hummed while kneading bread, while washing clothes, while brushing her hair before bed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and Eli whittled a piece of wood on the porch, Clara stepped out with a folded piece of parchment in her hand. "I wrote to my father," she said. Eli looked up, pausing. "You send it?" "No." He waited. "I thought I would, but when I finished writing, I didn't feel the need to anymore." Eli nodded, understanding something deeper than the words she'd written. "What did you tell him?" Clara smiled. "That I wasn't coming back, and that for the first time I didn't feel lost." That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara took his hand. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the bookshelf, and the garden, and the tree." Eli tilted his head slightly. "Yeah? I want to stay, not just for the season, not just until it's safe. I want to put down roots, with you." His expression softened. "You already have." She looked around the room, glowing with firelight and quiet joy. "I never thought peace would look like this," she whispered. Eli gave her hand a squeeze. "Neither did I." A few days later, Eli rode into town for supplies. His first trip in months. When he returned, he brought back more than flour and salt. He brought a worn, carved wooden sign. He nailed it gently above the front door. It read, "Morgan and Mayfield Cabin, Est this winter." Clara traced the letters with her fingers, eyes glistening. "It's not just yours anymore," he said. "It's ours." And in that quiet corner of the woods, with a tree taking root and two hearts learning how to bloom again, the cabin was no longer just a shelter from the cold. It was a home. The seasons rolled forward, each one marking time not with clocks or calendars, but with the rhythm of life. Seedlings turning to harvest, sunlit mornings giving way to starlit evenings, and the unmistakable echo of two people choosing one another, again and again. Clara began keeping a journal, not out of fear she'd forget, but to remember fully. The way Eli stirred his coffee with the back of a spoon. The sound of snow falling on pine needles. The moment she realized she didn't flinch when someone knocked on the door anymore. It wasn't the kind of life she thought she'd end up living. It was better. One afternoon in late summer, Eli came back from the woods carrying something unexpected. A small battered saddlebag. Inside, torn fabric, a water-stained map, and a note. Scrawled in rushed handwriting, "Granger's gone east. Gave up. No reward. Said she was dead." Eli handed it to Clara. She stared at the note, the past catching her like a whisper. Then she folded it once, twice, and dropped it into the fire. The flames curled around the paper and erased it. "Guess I'm free," she said simply. "You always were," Eli replied. They celebrated that night with canned peaches and laughter that came from somewhere deeper than their lungs. Clara danced barefoot across the wood floor while Eli played an old tune on a harmonica he hadn't touched in years. "You're terrible," she teased, twirling. He grinned. "I only know one song." "Then play it again." Weeks later, a letter came, hand-delivered by a trader from town. It was from a woman Clara had met long ago back in Elk Creek. A quiet girl with sharp eyes and a braver heart than she let on. She wrote, "I heard what you did, what you left, what you found. If you're ever ready to share it, I think a lot of women would like to know how you made it out." Clara reread that line over and over, then set the letter aside and looked at the window where Eli was chopping wood in the evening light, sleeves rolled, jaw set. "I didn't make it out," she whispered. "I made it home." That night she placed a blank sheet of paper on the table, picked up her pen, and wrote the first line. "It started with a stranger in the woods who told me to stay one night." Clara's letter began with honesty. Not the polished, careful truth of high society, but the raw kind, the kind shaped by frostbite and firelight. She didn't write it to expose anyone. She wrote it for the women who still stood at the edge of a choice, hearts torn between the life that was expected of them, and the one that called quietly from somewhere wild. "He didn't ask for my past. He didn't demand I forget it either. He let me arrive as I was, tired, bruised, half-frozen, and unsure, and somehow without ever saying the words, he gave me space to become someone new." Clara wrote in the evenings after the chores were done, when the porch was cool and quiet, and Eli sat beside her with his boots up, carving another piece of pine into something small and thoughtful. She didn't tell him everything she wrote, but she knew he felt it in the way she looked at him after. The manuscript was mailed to a friend in town who promised to pass it along to someone in publishing. Clara expected nothing. She had no dreams of fame, no desire for her name on book covers. But a month later, a letter came back. Not just interest, excitement. Her words had stirred something in the editor's gut. They wanted to print it under the title Clara had scribbled on the first page, "The Cabin That Chose Me." Eli was quiet when she told him. Not because he wasn't proud, but because he already knew she was meant for something beyond surviving. She waited for him to say more. He didn't, not at first. Then, after a long sip of coffee and a glance toward the little tree they'd planted months ago, he finally said, "You think the cabin's big enough for a writer?" Clara smiled. "I don't need big, I just need you." Autumn arrived like a sigh, cool, golden, and content, and as the air turned crisp and the leaves blushed deep red, Clara and Eli sat side by side on the porch, wrapped in a worn quilt stitched from two separate pasts. No longer running, no longer hiding, just writing a new chapter, together. Winter came again, but this time, it didn't arrive like an enemy. It came like a friend returning, familiar, cold, but no longer feared. The first snowfall blanketed the cabin roof quietly, settling like a promise rather than a threat. Inside, the hearth glowed warm. The smell of stew hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of pine from the boughs Clara had hung above the doorway. She'd never celebrated holidays much before, not truly. But this year, something inside her had changed. This year, she wanted to mark the time. This year, everything mattered. Eli returned from chopping wood, snow clinging to his coat. Clara helped brush him off, then lingered by his side, her hand staying on his arm a second longer than usual. "Storm's rolling in," he said, nodding toward the sky. "Could get heavy." Clara glanced out the window, then leaned against his shoulder. "Let it, we're ready this time." They spent the afternoon in small rituals. Clara read by the fire. Eli repaired a hinge on the old cupboard. Their dog, a mutt Clara had taken in during the summer, snored at their feet, twitching in his sleep. No grand declarations, no fancy gowns, just a kind of love that came from doing the same thing side by side, day after day. Later that night, Clara pulled down a small wooden box from the shelf. Inside, scraps of fabric, ribbon, and two small stitched baby shoes. She laid them on the table. Eli looked over, his eyes narrowing gently with surprise. "You sure?" he asked. Clara smiled, a little breathless. 3 months. He sat beside her slowly, not speaking at first. Then he reached out, covering her hands with his calloused ones. "I never thought this would be part of my life again," he murmured. "It wasn't supposed to be part of mine either," Clara whispered. "But this, you, us, none of this was supposed to happen. And yet, here we are." They sat there for a long while, the fire crackling low, the snow falling in slow, steady waves outside. And when Eli finally pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, there were no words needed. Only warmth, only belonging, only love wrapped in a cabin full of quiet miracles. The snow didn't stop for days. It gathered on the cabin roof, spilled down from branches in soft thumps, and blanketed the path Eli had carved through the woods. The world outside slowed, muffled beneath layers of white. But inside the cabin, life moved forward. Steadily, meaningfully. Clara had taken to writing again, not stories for publishers, but letters. She dated each one carefully, folded them neatly, and tucked them into a wooden box Eli had carved for her. One letter read, "To our child, if you ever wonder how two people came to be here, know that your mother ran from a cage, and your father lived in a forest like a ghost. And somehow they found each other in the space between fear and firelight." Eli, in his quiet way, had begun building a cradle. Pine wood, hand-sanded, every joint fitted with care. Clara watched him work from her chair near the hearth, a hand resting gently on the curve of her belly. She didn't say anything at first, just watched the man she loved pour himself into something small, something sacred. "You planning to carve your name into it?" she asked softly. He looked up, brows lifted. "Yours too," she smiled. "Only fair." They received a letter from town not long after. A simple note that Clara's book had sold out its first printing. Women had been writing in. Some from cities. Some from farmlands. All of them thanking her for saying the things they'd never dared say aloud. Eli read the letter, then handed it back with a soft grunt. "You started something," he said. "I just told the truth. That's what makes it something." One evening, as the wind howled like a distant choir beyond the trees, Clara brought out a new journal. On the first page, she wrote a single sentence. "Oh, love didn't find me. I made room for it." Then she looked up, finding Eli already watching her. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Which part?" "Letting me stay that first night." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I didn't let you stay, Clara," he said gently. "I needed you to." And for the rest of the night, they spoke of things they hadn't yet voiced. Hopes, names, futures, and none of it was hurried. Because when you've already survived the worst of the world, building a better one, together, becomes something sacred. The thaw came late that year, but when it arrived like grace. Snow turned to water, trickling into the roots of trees and soaking deep into the mountain's veins. The cabin's roof dripped steadily in the mornings, and steam rose from the woodpile as it dried in the slow sun. Spring birds called again, bold and unafraid, and the woods around the cabin hummed with return. Clara moved slower now, not from fear but from the life she carried. Her steps were measured, her breath deeper, her heart larger. Eli was never far from her. He'd always been quiet, always steady, but now there was a new softness in him, a watchfulness that spoke of something deeper than protection, of love, in its most enduring form. He added railings to the porch, built a bench beneath the window where the sunlight fell best in the afternoon, carved a second chair for her writing table. And when she protested that she could still lift the heavy pail of water from the well, he answered with nothing but a raised brow and took it from her hand. "I'm not helpless," she said once, teasing. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm doing this while I still have the chance." One morning, Clara sat beneath the pine tree they had planted that first spring together. It had grown tall now, no longer a fragile sapling, but a real part of the land. Its roots ran deep, and under its shade, she began to hum the lullaby she'd heard her mother sing long ago, one she never thought she'd use. She wasn't singing for herself anymore. She was singing to someone, to a future not yet born but already belonged. Inside the cabin, Eli polished the last piece of the cradle. He ran a hand along the edge, then leaned back, studying it. It was solid, clean, beautiful in its simplicity. He carved one final detail on the base, a tiny pine tree, etched beside the initials CM plus EM. When Clara returned from her walk, she saw it and pressed a hand to her chest. "You remembered," she whispered. Eli looked up. "I remember everything." That night, as stars filled the sky and the forest settled into a lullaby of wind and branches, Eli lay beside her, hand resting over hers, over the small miracle they had made together. "Tell me again," Clara said, "what you thought when you first saw me stumbling out of those trees." Eli chuckled deep and low. "I thought, trouble's got a pretty face this time." Clara laughed, then sobered. "And now?" He turned to face her, brushing a lock of hair from her brow. "Now I think I almost missed the best part of my life. The baby came in the heart of spring, not with panic, not with fear, but with breathless hours filled with soft encouragement, firm hands, and the kind of strength only born from surviving other storms first." Eli never left her side. He'd faced down guns and wild men, hunger and winter itself, yet nothing humbled him more than watching Clara bring life into the world. When it was over, and she lay wrapped in sweat and blankets, cradling a tiny, squirming girl against her chest, he sat beside her, silent, his hands trembling just slightly. "She's here," Clara whispered. Eli nodded. "And she's perfect." They named her June, for the promise of light, even after a long winter. She had Clara's eyes, Eli's quiet, and a strength that didn't need to be loud. Neighbors from the valley came in the days that followed, bringing bread, blankets, and curious smiles. Some knew bits of Clara's story. Some didn't. All of them left with something quieter in their hearts after stepping into the cabin where something good had taken root. The cabin had changed, of course. There was a cradle now, and a string of wildflowers hung above the hearth. There were books in piles, more than shelves could hold. There was laughter, daily, abundant. But more than that, there was belonging. Years passed the way years always do, slow until they're not. June learned to walk where the pines met the porch, learned to read on her mother's lap, learned to fish with her father before breakfast. She'd grow up hearing the story of how her parents met, not a tale of sweeping romance or galloping horses, but of quiet decisions, one night of kindness, and the courage it took to stay. On a summer night a few years later, Clara stood beneath the tree they'd planted, now towering above her, its roots deep and wide. She held June in her arms. Her daughter's head nestled against her shoulder, and looked out at the horizon. Eli stepped up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "We've built something good," he said. "No," Clara replied, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "We've built something true." And in the cabin where a stranger once stayed one night, a family grew, a past healed, and love, quiet and unwavering, chose to remain, long after the snow had melted and the stories had been written. Because sometimes the greatest journey isn't the one across the land, but the one that leads you home.